He was the Alpha King of the Northern Bloodstone Pack, a title that sounded impressive until you realized it mostly involved mediating disputes over fence lines and approving the budget for the annual pack barbecue. She was an Omega, running a coffee shop called Grounds for Divorce, a business decision that made perfect sense if you knew her parents. He hadn't smiled since a particularly grim documentary about declining bee populations in 2014. She smiled every time a customer ordered a ridiculously complicated drink with 8 modifiers, because it was job security. He lost a poker game. She won a king. Now he was standing in her stockroom, staring at an apron that was the color of a flamingo's fever dream, and his wolf, the great and terrible beast of his bloodline, was growling in his head that the apron was an insult to their ancestors, and that this entire building smelled offensively of cinnamon and chaos. This was not how his reign was supposed to go. Rose Castillo was an Omega, and her wolf, a sleek, copper-furred creature with impeccable posture, had opinions. But that comes later. The charity poker game had been Marcus's idea. Marcus, his beta and lifelong friend, had the infuriating belief that what Alpha King Callum needed wasn't more efficient trade agreements, but fun. Fun, in this case, meant being crammed into the stuffy back room of a community hall with 6 other alphas, all posturing and trying to scent mark the cheap folding chairs, while a human woman with a terrifyingly cheerful volunteer shirt dealt cards. Callum had been prepared for the political maneuvering, the subtle challenges for dominance played out over a full house versus a flush. He was not prepared for Rose Castillo. She hadn't been invited. She'd apparently wandered in looking for the bake sale, saw the free mini quiches on the snack table, and decided to stay. She played poker with the chaotic energy of a squirrel in a hurricane, raising on terrible hands, folding on good ones, and distracting everyone with long, rambling stories about the volatile politics of sourcing single-origin coffee beans from Guatemala. The other alphas, used to stoic silence and meaningful glares, were completely thrown. They folded, one by one, unnerved by her sheer unpredictability. It came down to him and her. He held a king high straight, a solid, dependable, logical hand. He was the Alpha King. This was fate. He met her gaze across the table, ready to deliver the final, crushing blow. She was squinting at her cards, her brow furrowed. "Okay, so," she'd said, tapping a finger against her chin, "does the little horsey beat the angry-looking one-eyed dude?" Someone coughed. Callum felt a vein begin to throb in his temple. "That is a knight, and a jack. And yes." Cool, she nodded, then pushed her entire meager pile of chips into the center of the table. "I'm all in." His wolf, a usually sensible creature that valued quiet dignity, ancestral honor, and long naps, briefly opened one eye. It assessed the situation. It closed the eye again. "Wake me when it's over," it rumbled. "This is beneath us." He saw her bet and raised, putting something on the table he never, ever wagered. His time. "If I win," he said, his voice a low rumble that usually made his council members flinch, "you will rename your blasphemously titled shop to something more dignified. The King's Bean, perhaps." Rose had snorted, a sound of pure, undiluted derision. "Get real. And if I win? You work for me. For 1 month, behind the counter. Apron mandatory." The room went silent. Marcus choked on a mini quiche. Callum, supremely confident in his straight, had agreed with a curt nod. It was the worst decision he had made since agreeing to taste test his Aunt Mildred's experimental lunar herb casserole. Rose had laid down her cards, a pair of 2s, a pair of 7s, and a 5th card she'd held aloft with a triumphant grin. Another 7. A full house. She'd won with dumb, blundering, chaotic luck. She'd beaten the Alpha King's logic with the poker equivalent of tripping and falling over the finish line. Which led him here, to the pink apron. It had ruffles on the straps and a pocket embroidered with a winking coffee cup. It was an affront to his ancestors, his title, and his very soul. Problem? Rose's voice cut through his internal crisis. She was leaning against the doorframe, arms crossed, one eyebrow arched. She was wearing a flour-dusted black t-shirt that said, "Depresso, the feeling you get when you've run out of coffee." His wolf cracked open an eye again. It surveyed Rose. It surveyed the apron. "Absolutely not," it said, with the cold finality of a judge passing sentence. "We have dignity. We have a legacy stretching back 17 generations. We do not wear ruffles." But Callum, the man, not the wolf, found himself looking at the way she leaned against the doorframe, one ankle crossed over the other, her chin tilted up in a challenge. There was something in the angle of it, the defiance of it, that was oddly magnetic. No one challenged him. No one ever had. He didn't know what to do with the fact that a small part of him, a distinctly human part, found that he liked it. "It is vibrant," Callum said, his voice tight. "It's pink. The color is pink," she corrected him. "And it's not optional. It's part of the uniform, which also includes not looking like you're about to sentence someone to a lifetime of hard labor. Try to look approachable." He stared at her. He had spent his entire adult life cultivating an aura of unapproachability. It was his primary defense mechanism against chatty dignitaries and well-meaning pack elders who wanted to set him up with their daughters. Being approachable was not in his skill set. He put on the apron. The fabric was soft, an insult added to the injury of its color. The ruffles brushed against his shoulders. He felt his dignity shrivel up and die. His wolf made a sound like a funeral dirge. "There," Rose said, her lips twitching. "See? You look like a very large, very grumpy cupcake. Now come on, the morning rush is about to hit and you need to learn how to work the register. Rule number 1, the customer is always right." "That is a statistically improbable and strategically flawed business model," Callum stated flatly. Rose just stared at him for a long moment. "Rule number 2, she said slowly, is that you are absolutely not allowed to talk to the customers. At all. Just take their money and try not to scare them. Got it, Your Highness?" He gritted his teeth. "Understood." His wolf huffed. At least she recognizes the hierarchy. The morning rush at Grounds for Divorce was less a rush and more a stampede of caffeine-starved zombies. The small shop, with its mismatched chairs and walls covered in local art, was suddenly packed. The air filled with the roar of the espresso machine, the hiss of steaming milk, and Rose's voice, a beacon of cheerful authority in the storm. Callum was stationed at the register, his massive frame barely fitting behind the small counter. The pink apron felt like a brand. His sole job was to take orders and process payments. He approached it with the grim determination of a general planning a military campaign. He was efficient. He was precise. He was, as one customer whispered to her friend, terrifyingly intense for a barista. His first major error came in the form of a woman who wanted a half-calf soy milk extra foam 2-pump vanilla 1-pump hazelnut 120-degree latte. Callum stared at her. His mind, accustomed to complex geopolitical negotiations, short-circuited. "That is not a beverage," he said, his voice dangerously low. "That is a cry for help." The woman blinked. Rose, who seemed to have a sixth sense for his impending diplomatic incidents, swooped in. "What he means is, that's a fantastic choice, a true classic," she chirped, shoving him gently aside. "King Cupcake here is new. He's still learning the menu." She shot him a glare that could peel paint. He spent the next hour in silence, his fingers moving stiffly on the touchscreen register. His wolf was observing the chaos with the disdain of a museum curator forced to attend a children's finger painting class. "This establishment has no operational rhythm," it critiqued. "The workflow is inefficient. The syrup bottles are not arranged in alphabetical order." His second error was with a man who complained that his coffee was bitter. "It is coffee," Callum said, his patience worn to a microscopic thread. "Its defining characteristic is bitterness. That is its purpose." I just wanted a little more sugar," the man stammered, intimidated by Callum's sheer, unblinking presence. Before Rose could intervene, Callum reached for the sugar dispenser, poured a small mountain of it into a cup, and slid it across the counter. "Here," he said. "Enjoy your bean-flavored candy water." The man fled. Rose put her head in her hands and made a small, strangled noise. "You," she said, pointing a finger at him without looking up. "Go clean the bathroom. Now. And don't come out until you've thought about what you've done." He was the Alpha King. He commanded armies. He negotiated with ancient, powerful beings, and he was being sent to scrub a toilet because he had failed at customer service. As he walked toward the back, the sounds of the bustling cafe fading behind him, he could have sworn he heard a few of the regulars start to clap. The regulars were the worst. They had, within 2 days, figured out that the giant, scowling man in the pink apron was not just a new hire, but a source of premium, uncut entertainment. They came in droves, ordering simple black coffees just for the excuse to interact with him. "Good morning, sunshine," a cheerful older woman named Mrs. Gable would say every day. "You look radiant." Callum, who had been up since 4 a.m. reviewing pack security reports before his shift, would just stare at her until she shuffled away, giggling. Then there was Chad, a college student who seemed to view Callum as a personal challenge. "Hey, big guy," he'd said on day 3, leaning on the counter. "Can I get a latte? And can you make the foam look like a dragon?" Callum looked at the steaming pitcher of milk. He looked at the cup. He poured the milk directly into the center, creating a vaguely circular white blob. "It is an abstract dragon," he said, his voice deadpan. "It represents the futility of ambition." Chad loved it. He took a picture for his social media. The next day, 10 more people asked for abstract latte art. Callum gave them a minimalist squirrel, a deconstructed wave, and what he called a straight line representing the stark, unyielding march of time. Business, inexplicably, boomed. People weren't just coming for coffee anymore, they were coming for the show. Rose was torn. On one hand, her sales were up 30%. On the other, her new employee was an emotional black hole who treated every customer interaction like a hostage negotiation. "You can't just tell people their order is strategically incorrect," she hissed at him during a lull, wiping down the counter. "But it was," Callum insisted. "An iced espresso with 3 shots of caramel syrup negates the entire purpose of the espresso. The integrity of the bean is compromised." "The integrity of the bean?" Rose repeated, staring at him. "It's coffee, not a sacred relic. People are allowed to like sweet things." He opened his mouth to argue, and then she laughed, not at him, at the situation, at the absurdity of it, at the fact that the most powerful wolf on the continent was arguing about syrup ratios with the righteous intensity of a man defending a doctoral thesis. It was a full, unguarded laugh, her head tipping back, her eyes crinkling at the corners. Callum forgot what he was going to say. He forgot, for a moment, that he was the Alpha King. He forgot about the syrup and the bean integrity and the argument entirely. All he could process was the sound of her laugh, the way it filled up the small space behind the counter, the way it felt like standing in a patch of unexpected sunlight. Something shifted in his chest, something small and warm and entirely inconvenient. His wolf, who had been composing a mental list of sanitation code violations, paused. "What was that?" it asked suspiciously. "Nothing," Callum thought firmly. "Gas." Rose's wolf was named Elowin. Well, Rose's wolf wasn't named anything, technically. Wolves didn't have names. But Rose had named hers Elowin at age 12, because at age 12, Rose's wolf had manifested for the first time with the posture of a duchess and the disapproving stare of a librarian, and Rose had decided immediately that this creature was an Elowin. Elowin had standards. Elowin believed in clean lines, proper protocol, and that there was a correct way to greet another wolf, which involved a precise sequence of ear positions and tail angles. Elowin did not approve of mess, of noise, or of wolves who took up too much space. Elowin certainly did not approve of the enormous, brooding alpha wolf that had recently taken up residence in their territory. "His wolf is insufferable," Elowin communicated to Rose, in the way wolves communicated. Not in words exactly, but in sharp feelings and vivid images. She sent Rose a mental picture of Callum's wolf, huge, dark-furred, sprawled across their awareness like a shadow that refused to move. It does not groom properly. It is too large. It has the conversational charm of a boulder. Rose, who was in the middle of trying to teach Callum how to operate the milk steamer without scalding himself, had to bite the inside of her cheek. "Okay, so the wand goes in the milk at an angle," she said out loud. "Not straight down. You're not harpooning it." Callum adjusted the angle with the precise, careful movements of a man defusing a bomb. His forearm was very close to hers. She could see the tendons shift under his skin as he moved the pitcher. He had good hands, she noticed, large and steady, the kind of hands that look like they could hold something fragile without breaking it. "His wolf smells like old stone and disapproval," Elowen added, sending a wave of disdain. Rose focused on the milk. "Better. Now, you want to keep the tip just below the surface until you hear a sort of hissing, tearing sound. That's the sweet spot." "This process has entirely too many auditory benchmarks," Callum muttered, but he adjusted, and for a moment, the milk screamed in exactly the right way. "Yes, that! Hold it right there." He held it. The milk swirled and stretched into a smooth, velvety white. When he poured it into the cup, it didn't look like a heart or a leaf or anything recognizable. It looked like a slightly dented cloud, but it was microfoam. Real, actual, properly steamed microfoam. Rose looked up at him, surprised. "You did it." He looked down at the cup and then at her, and there was something in his expression, a flicker of unguarded pride, the kind a person only shows when they've genuinely tried at something small and succeeded. It was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual granite composure. "It was an acceptable outcome," he said, but Rose had seen it, that flicker. And she thought, for the first time, "Oh, there's someone in there." The problem with proximity, Callum was discovering, was that it made observation unavoidable. He noticed things. He didn't want to notice things. His entire survival strategy for the last decade had been built on not noticing things, on keeping the world at arm's length so it couldn't reach in and rearrange him. But it was day 7, and he noticed that Rose came in an hour before opening every morning. He noticed because he came in 45 minutes before opening to prep the register, and she was always already there, in the back, with the books. She kept the door to the tiny office mostly closed, but not all the way. Through the gap, he could see her hunched over her desk, a pen between her teeth, her brow furrowed. She looked, in those moments, nothing like the woman who made jokes and called him King Cupcake. She looked tired. She looked worried. She looked like someone who was carrying something heavy and had been carrying it for a long time and was getting very, very good at pretending it weighed nothing. On day 8, she got a phone call during the afternoon lull. Her phone buzzed, she glanced at the screen, and her entire body went still. Not frozen, not panicked. Just still. The way a person goes still when they've heard bad news so many times that their body has learned to brace before the brain catches up. She stepped into the back. She was gone for 4 minutes. When she came out, she was smiling, but her hands, when she picked up the milk pitcher, were shaking just slightly. She set the pitcher down, flexed her fingers, picked it up again. She didn't know he was watching. He said nothing. It wasn't his business. She wasn't his responsibility. He was here because of a poker game, because of a bet, because of dumb luck. That was all. His wolf, who had spent the week cataloging everything it disapproved of about the shop, the cluttered stockroom, the inconsistent temperature of the pastry display, the frankly criminal arrangement of the to-go cup lids, looked at Rose through Callum's eyes and said, grudgingly, "She works hard at least." It was the first thing his wolf had said about Rose that wasn't a complaint. Callum found this more alarming than any of the complaints. One afternoon, Lady Seraphina of the Silver Moon Pack swept into the shop. Seraphina was tall, elegant, and convinced that she was Callum's ideal mate, a belief she brought up at every political gathering. She was an alpha, tall and sharp-boned, and she carried that predatory energy into her human form with weaponized grace. Her arrival was always an event. She didn't walk, she glided. She didn't talk, she purred. She glided up to the counter, her eyes, the color of a winter sky, locking onto Callum. Her nostrils flared delicately. "Callum," she purred, her voice dripping with condescension. "What is this rustic little hobby you've acquired? And what is that ghastly thing you're wearing?" Callum glanced down at his pink apron. "It is a uniform," he stated. Rose appeared at his side, wiping her hands on her own apron. "Hi, welcome to Grounds for Divorce. What can I get for you?" she asked, her voice relentlessly cheerful. Serafina's gaze flickered to Rose, a quick up-and-down assessment. An Omega. Small. Coffee-stained. "I am speaking to the Alpha King," she said, a hint of steel in her tone. Inside Rose, Elowen's ears went flat. Her wolf sent a pulse of cold, precise fury. "She sees us as small. She is incorrect. We are not small. We are efficient." Rose kept her smile perfectly in place. "Great. And the Alpha King is currently on the clock, so unless you're ordering, you're holding up the line. We have a special on pumpkin spice muffins if you're feeling basic." Serafina's perfectly sculpted jaw dropped. No one spoke to her that way. Callum felt a jolt of something unexpected in his chest. Not his wolf, which was watching the interaction with the clinical interest of a spectator at a tennis match, but him, the man. He felt a surge of sharp, startled admiration. She didn't posture. She didn't flinch. She simply held her ground in her own shop, as though the most intimidating alpha in 3 territories was just another customer who couldn't decide between oat and almond. "I beg your pardon?" Serafina hissed. "No need to beg. It's a simple question," Rose replied, leaning forward conspiratorially. "Look, lady, I don't know who you are, but this is my shop. Here, he's not a king. He's a trainee barista who still can't tell the difference between a macchiato and a cappuccino. So order something, or please step aside for the nice lady who just wants an iced tea." Serafina looked from Rose's unimpressed face to Callum's stony one. She seemed to be searching for some sign that he would put this impertinent Omega in her place. He said nothing. He just stood there, a silent, pink-aproned mountain. He should have intervened. Protocol demanded it. Serafina was politically powerful, and alienating her had consequences. These were all excellent, rational, kingly reasons to step in. He didn't step in. He didn't step in because Rose Castillo had just called an alpha warrior basic, and Callum was fighting, for the first time in 12 years, the overwhelming, traitorous, deeply inconvenient urge to smile. The silence stretched. Defeated, Serafina finally snapped. "A black coffee, to go." "Coming right up," Rose chirped. As she turned away, she winked at him. He felt it then, a genuine, unfamiliar twitch at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a smile, not yet, but it was the closest he'd come since 2014. His wolf observed the twitch with suspicion. "What is your face doing?" it asked. "Nothing," Callum told it again. "Muscle spasm." His wolf said, unconvinced. On day 12, a pipe burst in the bathroom. Not a dramatic, cinematic burst, more of a slow, persistent weeping, as though the plumbing had simply given up on life. Rose discovered it at 6 in the morning, standing in a half-inch of water, her sneakers soaked, her expression one of bone-deep exhaustion. Callum found her there, wringing out a mop with the mechanical rhythm of someone who had wrung out a lot of mops. "I can call a plumber from the pack," he said. "They can be here in an hour." "Can't afford a plumber." She said it quickly, flatly, the way people say things they've said too many times. Then she caught herself, and the mask went back on, bright, breezy, unbreakable. "I mean, I've got this. It's just a pipe. I've watched YouTube tutorials. How hard can it be?" She pulled out her phone, typed, "How to fix burst pipe," with one hand, while mopping with the other. And Callum had the terrible, crystal-clear realization that this was how she did everything. Alone. With a mop in one hand and a search engine in the other, holding her world together with duct tape and sheer refusal to ask for help. He took the mop from her hand. She resisted for a moment, her fingers tightening on the handle, and then she let go. "I'll manage the water," he said. "Call the plumber. I'll cover the cost." "I'm not a charity case." "It's not charity. It's a loan against my future coffee. At the rate you charge for a flat white, you owe me approximately 30 years of pipe maintenance." She stared at him. Then she made a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and for one terrible, beautiful second, her mask dropped entirely. He saw what was underneath: exhaustion and fear, and a loneliness so familiar it made his chest ache, because he recognized it. He wore it too. He'd just been wearing it longer and in a nicer suit. She turned away before he could see more. "Fine," she said, her voice thick. "But it's a loan. I'm charging you interest." "Naturally," he said, and started mopping. His wolf watched the whole exchange in silence. When it was over, it said, very quietly, "She does not give up easily." "No," Callum agreed, "she doesn't." There was a long pause. Then his wolf added with great reluctance, as though the words were being extracted under duress, "That is not the worst quality." Rose noticed things too. That was the problem. She noticed that Callum remembered every single regular's order after hearing it once. Not because he was trying to be friendly, he wasn't capable of friendly, but because his mind was a steel trap that recorded information with the ruthless efficiency of a surveillance system. Mrs. Gable got her medium drip with cream before she reached the counter. Chad's oat milk latte was already being steamed when the door chimed. The man in the gray suit who came in at exactly 7:48 every morning never had to say a word. She noticed that when the shop got its busiest, when the noise was loudest and the line was longest, and Rose was running on caffeine and adrenaline and not much else, Callum got quieter. Not sulking quiet, steady quiet. He processed orders with a calm, relentless focus that anchored the entire room. She could feel it at her back, solid and unwavering, and she thought, this is what he does. This is what an alpha is. He holds the line so others don't have to. She noticed that he flinched when people thanked him. Not a big flinch, just a micro-hesitation, a half-second stutter in his movements, as though the word thanks was a small stone thrown at a window he'd forgotten was there. She noticed that he never ate lunch. She asked him once, during the afternoon lull, whether he wanted half of her sandwich. He looked at the sandwich, and then at her, with an expression of such bewildered incomprehension that she realized, with a lurch, that no one in his life ever just offered him things. Not tributes, not strategic gifts, not political favors, just a sandwich. Because she had one, and he didn't, and it was Tuesday. "It's turkey and Swiss," she said, suddenly self-conscious. "It's not going to explode." He took the half. He ate it in 3 bites. He didn't say thank you, because that word still seemed to jam in his throat. But the next morning, there was a bag of pastries on the counter from the expensive bakery 3 blocks over. The note, in his rigid, precise handwriting, said, "Nutritionally adequate breakfast items, non-negotiable." She stood in the empty shop, holding the bag, and felt something warm and reckless bloom in her chest. Elowen stirred. She sent Rose a series of sharp, warning images: a wall, a closed door, a wolf walking away. "Don't," Elowen said. "He is temporary. He is here because of a game. In 20 days, he will leave." "I know," Rose thought. She ate a croissant anyway. On day 15, Callum's wolf met Rose's wolf. Not metaphorically. Not in passing impressions or background feelings. Properly. It happened during a thunderstorm. The sky opened up at 3 in the afternoon, a curtain of rain so thick it emptied the shop within minutes. Lightning cracked, close and bright, and the power went out. Rose let out a yelp, more surprised than scared, and in the sudden dark, their wolves surged forward. An instinct, automatic, like a reflex action in response to a threat. Callum's wolf flared his awareness outward, scanning for danger, a massive, dark presence that filled the room like smoke. Rose's wolf, Elowen, snapped to attention, her awareness sharp and precise, sweeping the perimeter with the focused intensity of a general. and then their wolves became aware of each other. Not their humans, their wolves. In the dark, in the primal space between instinct and thought, they met. Callum's wolf assessed Eowyn the way it assessed everything, strategically. It noted her precision, her control, her refusal to yield even an inch of awareness. Compact, it admitted. Disciplined, Eowyn assessed Callum's wolf with equal coldness. She noted his size, his dominance, the way he had expanded to fill the entire sensory space without asking permission. Overbearing, she judged. Territorial. Presumes to protect what is not his. I protect what needs protecting, Callum's wolf rumbled. I did not ask for your protection, Eowyn responded, with the icy precision of a diplomat delivering a rejection. The lights flickered back on. Rose blinked. Callum exhaled. They looked at each other across the dark counter, both aware that something had just happened in the space between them. Something their wolves had done that neither of them had authorized. Well, Rose said, her voice slightly unsteady, that was dramatic. The power grid in this district is unreliable, Callum said. You should invest in a backup generator. Thank you for that romantic observation. She said it sarcastically, tossing it off like a throwaway line, but the word romantic landed in the space between them and just sat there, heavy and warm. She turned away quickly, busying herself with candles she didn't need now that the lights were back. In Callum's mind, his wolf was pacing. It did not pace. It never paced. It was a creature of stillness and certainty, and now it was pacing like a caged thing, unsettled by the small, fierce, copper-furred presence that had met it in the dark and refused to flinch. She has spine, his wolf conceded, as though this was a personal insult. The month was a blur of chaotic normalcy. Callum developed a system for restocking the napkins that was so efficient it bordered on art. He learned the names of the regulars and their orders, storing the information with the same mental acuity he used for treaty clauses. He even managed to produce a latte with a foam shape that vaguely resembled a heart, a feat which Rose rewarded with a surprised, genuine smile that made the warm, reckless thing in his chest flare brighter. He was still an awful barista. His social skills remained non-existent, and his attempts at friendly banter sounded like threats. But something had shifted. The shop had become his. The scent of it was ingrained in his clothes. The rhythm of it was in his bones. He found himself thinking about inventory levels during Royal Council meetings and mentally correcting his beta's terrible coffee order. Marcus, for his part, was having the time of his life. He came in every morning, ordered the most complicated drink he could think of, and watched his king struggle, a beatific smile on his face. You know, Marcus said one day, leaning against the counter while Callum wrestled with the whipped cream dispenser, the pack is going insane. The gossip network is reporting that you've been domesticated by a tiny, fierce Omega and forced into manual labor. Morale has never been higher. I am not domesticated, Callum growled, finally getting the dispenser to work, sending a plume of cream onto the counter. Of course not, Your Majesty, Marcus said, his eyes twinkling. You're just willingly wearing a pink apron and taking orders from the only person in the kingdom who isn't terrified of you. It's completely different. He took a sip of his drink, then grew quiet for a moment. She's good for you, you know. Callum didn't answer. He just started cleaning up the whipped cream with methodical, angry swipes of a cloth. I'm serious, Cal. I've known you since we were pups. You don't eat lunch, you don't sleep. You run this kingdom like a man trying to outwork his own loneliness. And it's been killing you so slowly that nobody noticed except me. Marcus set down his cup. You smiled yesterday. I saw it. Mrs. Gable made that terrible sunshine joke and you smiled. And I almost fell off my chair because I'd forgotten what it looked like. I did not smile. You absolutely smiled. It was a facial irregularity. Marcus laughed, but his eyes were serious. Keep her, Cal. Whatever it takes. Callum said nothing. But that night, alone in the palace, he stood at his window and looked out at the dark, and the quiet that had been his companion for years felt less like peace and more like absence. The financial crisis didn't arrive like a storm. It arrived like a tide, slow and relentless, water rising around Rose's ankles while she was too busy smiling at customers to look down. Callum saw it in increments. The phone calls she stepped away for that were getting more frequent. The letter she'd found in the mail slot on day 18, read quickly and shoved into her back pocket with a sharp exhale. The way she'd started buying cheaper beans, ones that didn't smell right, that ground unevenly, that made the espresso taste flat. She thought he wouldn't notice. She underestimated how much attention he was paying. On day 22, he arrived at the shop at 5 a.m., an hour before her, because he'd been unable to sleep. He found a stack of envelopes that had been pushed through the mail slot overnight. He picked them up. He shouldn't have looked. He looked. 3 of them had red stamps. Past due. Final notice. The third was from her landlord. Rent increase, effective immediately. He put them back on the counter, exactly where he'd found them. He tied on his apron. He started the espresso machine. When Rose arrived, she saw the letters. She picked them up. She didn't look at them in front of him. She took them to the back and closed the door all the way, which she never did. She was in there for 7 minutes. When she came out, her eyes were bright and her smile was the most determined, most fragile, most heartbreaking thing he had ever seen. "Morning, King Cupcake," she said. "Ready to make some terrible coffee?" He looked at her and the ache in his chest was so acute it almost winded him. He wanted to fix it. He wanted to take the letters and shred them and write checks and make the fear go away. But he knew her. He'd spent 22 days learning her, and he knew that if he offered money, if he swooped in like a king to rescue the damsel, she would never forgive him. She would see it as proof that she couldn't do it alone, and being able to do it alone was the foundation her entire self had been built on. So he said, "I'll prep the cold brew." And she said, "Thank you," in a voice that had absolutely nothing to do with cold brew, and everything to do with the fact that he hadn't pitied her, hadn't pushed, hadn't tried to fix what she hadn't asked him to fix. In his mind, his wolf was watching Rose with an expression that Callum had never seen on it before. It wasn't strategic assessment. It wasn't grudging respect. It was something rawer than that, something the wolf didn't have a name for. "She carries it alone," his wolf said. "She should not have to carry it alone." For once, Callum and his wolf were in complete, aching agreement. It all broke open on a Tuesday, day 25. Rose was in the back going over invoices, and she wasn't pretending anymore. The mask was off because she thought the door was closed. It wasn't. It was open an inch, and Callum, bringing a stack of clean towels to the shelf just outside, could hear her, could hear the small, choked sound she made when the numbers didn't work, no matter how many times she rearranged them. He stood there, towels in his arms, and listened to the woman who had faced down an alpha warrior with a wink and called a pack of ancient elders grumpy Gandalfs make a sound like something inside her was finally, quietly, breaking. He set the towels down. He pushed the door open. She looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, and for a single, horrible second, he saw it all. The shame, the fury, the terror of being seen at her worst by the person whose opinion she had, without meaning to, started to care about. "Everything's fine," she said, and her voice cracked on the word fine, like a bone under pressure. "Let me see," he said. It wasn't a request. She hesitated. Her jaw worked. Elowyn, inside her, sent a sharp, protective flare. "Don't. He doesn't get to see us broken. We are not broken. We are handling it." But Rose was so tired. She was so tired of handling it. She was tired of being the one who held it all together with wit and stubbornness and a smile that hurt her face by the end of every day. She was tired of carrying it alone. She pushed the papers toward him. He pulled up a stool, picked up a pen, and took the first invoice from the pile. "Tell me about your suppliers," he said, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of chaos. She started talking. It came out in a rush. The rent increase, the supplier costs, the broken equipment she'd been patching instead of replacing, the loan she'd taken out 2 years ago that was bleeding her dry with interest. She talked and he listened, and he didn't interrupt, and he didn't wince, and he didn't look at her with pity. He looked at the papers with the same focused intensity he'd used on the espresso machine, as though her problems were a system that could be understood and optimized, and he was simply going to understand and optimize them. When she finished, she felt hollowed out and strangely lighter, like a ship that had thrown its ballast overboard. "This is solvable," he said. She laughed, a wet, disbelieving sound. "You don't have to say that." He looked at her. "I don't say things I don't mean. It's one of my many social deficiencies. This is solvable. I need the night. Can you give me the night?" She looked at him, this ridiculous, enormous man in a pink ruffled apron, sitting on a too small stool, holding her failures in his steady hands. And she nodded. That night, long after Rose had gone home, Callum was still at the shop. The doors were locked, the lights were low, but he was wide awake, fueled by black coffee and a grim sense of purpose. He had brought his personal laptop from the palace, a sleek, powerful machine that was currently processing a decade's worth of poorly organized financial data from a shoebox labeled tax stuff. He worked for hours, his mind slipping into the familiar, comforting world of spreadsheets and projections. He restructured her debt. He cross-referenced supplier costs and found 3 areas where she was being overcharged. He built a new inventory management system that would automate her ordering. He found grants for small businesses she was eligible for. He drafted a letter to her landlord, citing 6 building code violations he'd cataloged during his bathroom cleaning exile, with a politely worded suggestion that the rent increase be reconsidered. He took the chaotic, beautiful, failing mess of her business and, piece by piece, he made it strong. He didn't do it as the Alpha King. He didn't use royal funds or pack resources. He did it as a man who was very good with numbers, sitting in a small shop that smelled like cinnamon, working through the night because someone he cared about was hurting, and this was the only language he knew for love. Because that's what it was. He could see it now, in the quiet hours after midnight, with his defenses down and his wolf asleep and no one to perform for. He could see it clearly, the thing he'd been building toward for 25 days, the thing that had started as a twitch at the corner of his mouth and grown, quietly, relentlessly, into something that filled his entire chest. He was in love with her. Not his wolf. Him. Callum. The man who hadn't smiled in 12 years was in love with a woman who had named her shop after a legal dissolution and called him King Cupcake, and the terrifying, wonderful, impossible truth of it sat in his chest like a second heartbeat. His wolf stirred, half asleep. It looked at the emotion Callum was holding, the huge, frightening, unmistakable shape of it. The wolf observed it for a long moment. "Ah," it said. "Finally. You're very slow, you know." Callum stared at the spreadsheet on his screen, his vision blurring. "You knew?" "I suspected," his wolf admitted, "since the pipe, when she let us take the mop. No one has ever trusted us with something that small. Kings are trusted with nations. She trusted us with a mop." He paused. "Her wolf, though, Eowyn, she is still impossible. Rigid, opinionated, with an absurdly high opinion of her own organizational methods. Coming from you," Callum thought dryly, "that's remarkable." His wolf huffed. "I am rigorous. She is rigid. There is a difference." Callum almost laughed. Almost. The sun was just beginning to tint the sky a pale, hazy gray when he finally leaned back, the last projection complete. He had saved her business. He had built a fortress of financial security around her dream. He closed his eyes, just for a moment, the exhaustion hitting him like a wave. He laid his head down on his arms, right on top of a stack of neatly organized spreadsheets, the scent of paper and cinnamon filling his senses. He was asleep in seconds. Rose came in early the next morning, a cloud of dread hanging over her. She was expecting to face the same pile of insurmountable debt, the same crushing reality that her dream was slipping through her fingers. She unlocked the door, her heart heavy, and stepped inside. The first thing she noticed was the silence. The old, wheezing refrigerator in the back seemed to have been muffled. The second was the low, rhythmic sound of breathing. Her eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she saw him. Callum. Slumped over her desk, his head pillowed on a stack of what looked like spreadsheets. He was fast asleep, his usually stern features softened in repose. His ridiculously broad shoulders rose and fell with each breath. The pink apron was still tied around his waist, now slightly rumpled. He looked huge and out of place, and utterly, completely devoted. She crept closer, her heart doing a strange, stuttering dance in her chest. The papers weren't her chaotic mess anymore. They were neat, organized stacks. On his laptop screen was a financial projection chart, and all the arrows were pointing up. She saw notes in his precise, elegant handwriting in the margins of her supplier invoices. Negotiate for 15% bulk discount, one said. Redundant expense, said another. There was a drafted letter to her landlord that was so politely threatening it was practically a work of art. He had stayed all night. He had taken her chaos, her failure, her fear, and he had made it manageable. Not with a king's decree or a bag of gold, with his time, with his mind, with his effort. Quietly, in the dead of night, while the world was asleep, no one had ever fought for her like this. Not her parents, who had given her chaos instead of stability. Not the ex-boyfriend who'd called her shop a cute hobby. Not the friends who'd said, "Let me know if you need anything," and then vanished when she actually needed something. This man, this impossible, grumpy, apron-wearing king, had seen her drowning and hadn't thrown her a rope. He had waded in. Inside her, Elowen was very still. Not the rigid, controlled stillness of a wolf maintaining composure, but the deep, trembling stillness of something cracking open. Elowen looked at Callum's wolf through Rose's eyes, the great, dark, infuriating beast that had been occupying their space for weeks. She saw it curled protectively over Rose's paperwork, over Rose's dream, over everything Rose had ever built. Not because it was his territory, because it was hers. "Oh," Elowen said very quietly. "Oh, I see." And for the first time since Rose was 12 years old, her prim, proper, unshakable wolf had nothing else to say. Rose reached out. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before she gently brushed a lock of dark hair off his forehead. His hair was softer than she expected. His eyes fluttered open. For a second, they were unfocused, vulnerable. Then they sharpened, locking on her, and he sat up straight, instantly alert, a king again. "I fell asleep," he said, his voice rough. "You stayed all night," she whispered, her hand still hovering near his face. He looked at the papers, then back at her. "Your books are balanced. Your profit margin should increase by 18% if you implement these changes. The business is viable." He delivered the news like a military report, all facts, no emotion. But she saw it, in the weary lines around his eyes, in the protective set of his shoulders, in the way his hands, those big, steady hands, were resting on her paperwork like they were guarding it. "Why?" she asked, her voice thick. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the mask of the Alpha King crack completely. She saw the man underneath. Not the wolf. The man. And he was terrified. "Because it's yours," he said simply. "And because He stopped, swallowed. The words jammed in his throat the way "thank you" always did, because this was a bigger word, and it was even harder. She waited. He couldn't say it, not yet. The muscle memory of 12 years of silence was too strong. He closed his mouth, his jaw tight, and looked away, and she could see him hating himself for the failure. She took his hand. She just reached down and took it, lacing her fingers through his, and his hand closed around hers so tightly, so immediately, that she understood. His hands had been waiting to hold something for a very long time. "I know," she said softly. "Me too." And in the quiet of the little coffee shop, with the sun rising outside, they stayed like that, hand in hand over a stack of spreadsheets, and neither of them let go. The last day of the month arrived with a quiet sort of dread. Neither of them mentioned it. The air in the shop was thick with unspoken words. Callum was even more silent than usual, moving with a stiff formality that hadn't been there the day before. Rose found herself making mistakes, spilling milk, giving a customer decaf by accident. The regulars noticed. Mrs. Gable gave Rose a sympathetic pat on the hand. Chad ordered a simple black coffee, foregoing his usual request for abstract art. The day ended. They cleaned the shop in near silence, the familiar routine feeling foreign and final. Callum untied the pink apron, folded it with military precision, and placed it on the counter between them. The gesture felt like a treaty being signed, a surrender. "My month is concluded," he said, his voice flat, his eyes fixed on a point just over her shoulder. Rose's heart felt like a lead weight in her chest. This was it. He would go back to his palace, to his council meetings and his royal duties. He would trade his pink apron for a crown. And she would go back to running her shop, only now it would feel impossibly large and quiet. The silence he left behind would be deafening. "Right," she said, her voice sounding thin and reedy. "Well, thanks for, the spreadsheets, and the pipe, and the landlord letter, and the—" Her voice was listing things because it was easier than saying the one thing she actually meant. "You are welcome," he replied formally. They stood there for a long, agonizing moment. In Callum's mind, his wolf was doing something it had never done in their entire shared existence. It was pressing forward, not with a command or an instinct, but with a plea. It showed him images, the shop in morning light, the sound of the register, the pink apron, Rose's laugh, the real one, the one that made her eyes crinkle. "Stay," it said, and the word carried no strategy, no logic. It was just a wolf, howling into the dark, asking its human not to leave the only place that had ever felt like a den. In Rose's mind, Elowen was standing perfectly still, head high, dignified as always. But her ears were trembling, and she was looking at the door as though, if Callum walked through it, something in her would break that she would never know how to fix. Callum turned to go. His hand was on the doorknob. "Wait!" The word burst out of her, small and desperate. She hadn't meant to say it. Elowen hadn't authorized it. It came from someplace deeper than either of them, from Rose herself, the woman underneath the wolf. He froze, his back still to her. She swallowed. Her throat was tight, her eyes burning. She couldn't offer him a crown. She couldn't offer him a kingdom. All she had was this small, chaotic, beautiful life she'd built with her own two hands. "I don't want you to go." She said it quietly, and the words cost her everything. Every wall she'd ever built, every time she'd said, "I'm fine," when she wasn't. Every year she'd spent proving she didn't need anyone. It all came crashing down in 6 words. He turned around slowly. His face was unreadable, a mask of stone. But his eyes were a storm. She picked up the folded pink apron, held it out to him. Her hand was shaking. "You still owe me a decent latte," she said, and her voice was stronger now, because this part she knew. The joke, the deflection, the bridge between vulnerability and safety. "You've been here a month and you still can't make one that doesn't look like a Rorschach test? Your training isn't finished." She was giving him a door to walk through. A way to stay that didn't require either of them to say the enormous, terrifying thing out loud. He looked at the apron. He looked at her, and then the alpha king of the Northern Bloodstone Pack, the man who hadn't smiled since 2014, who had spent his entire life behind walls so high he'd forgotten there was a world outside them, did something extraordinary. He smiled. It was slow and real, and it cracked his face open like sunrise after a long, dark night. It chased the shadows from his eyes and made him look like someone who had just found the thing he'd been looking for his entire life, and was amazed to discover it had been waiting in a small coffee shop the whole time. He walked back to the counter. He took the apron from her outstretched hand. His fingers brushed hers, and he held them there, just for a moment. "You should know," he said, his voice low and rough, "that I am a very slow learner." She smiled, tears tracking down her cheeks. "Good," I'm a very patient teacher. He tied on the apron. He was home. In his mind, his wolf settled down with a deep, contented exhale, curling into a space that finally felt like it fit. And Elowen, prim, proper, impossible Elowen, did something she had never done before. She curled up next to him. Not touching, not yet, but close. Close enough. He went back. Of course he went back. He was the Alpha King, and the kingdom didn't stop needing a king just because he'd fallen in love in a coffee shop. He had a duty to his people, and Rose understood duty. She was the woman who opened her shop at 5 every morning, even when the numbers didn't work, because the regulars needed their coffee, and their community, and their terrible jokes with Mrs. Gable. She understood what it meant to show up for the people who depended on you. So on the morning after the last day, Callum returned to the palace. He hung the pink apron in his closet next to his formal robes. He sat at his desk, opened his reports, and tried to read a trade agreement about lumber tariffs with the Southern Ridge Pack. He read the first sentence 4 times. The words kept rearranging themselves into the shape of her face. His wolf was no help. It lay curled in the back of his mind, nose tucked under its tail, radiating a low, persistent ache like a bruise that wouldn't heal. It didn't complain, it didn't howl, it just ached, and that was worse, because a howl he could argue with. An ache just sat there and told the truth. The palace was quiet. It had always been quiet, but he had never noticed before how the quiet sounded. It sounded like absence. It sounded like a shop that wasn't humming with an espresso machine and a woman's voice calling out orders, and a door chime that meant someone new had walked in from the cold. It sounded like a life with everything in it except the one thing that made it worth living. He lasted 3 days. On the first day, he held his council meetings and made decisions and was perfectly efficient. And his council said nothing, because he was exactly the king he had always been. On the second day, Marcus brought him a coffee from the palace kitchen. Callum took 1 sip and set it down. "This is wrong," he said. "It's the same blend you've been drinking for years," Marcus said. "I know," Callum said. "It's wrong." Marcus looked at him for a long moment and said nothing, but his eyes said everything. On the third day, Callum was reviewing a proposal for new border patrol routes when he realized he had drawn a small coffee cup in the margin of the document. He stared at it. He had never doodled in his life. He had never had a reason to let his mind wander, because his mind had never had anywhere it wanted to go. Now it did. He picked up his phone. He had never texted anyone except Marcus, and those texts were exclusively logistical. He stared at the screen. He typed, "The coffee here is inadequate." He deleted it. He typed, "I find myself thinking about your inventory management system." He deleted it. He typed, "I miss..." He deleted the entire message, set the phone down, and pressed his fingers to his temples. His wolf cracked open one eye. "Just call her, you coward." Rose was fine. She was completely fine. The shop was running smoothly, the new financial system Callum had built was working perfectly, and she had her routine back. Her quiet, independent, perfectly functional routine. She didn't need a 6'4" wolf king cluttering up her counter and insulting her customers and making her laugh at the worst possible moments. She was fine. She was not fine. The shop felt enormous without him. The space behind the counter where he used to stand, too large for it, his shoulders blocking the syrup display. It just sat there, empty, like a missing tooth. Mrs. Gable came in on the first morning and looked at the empty space and looked at Rose and said, "Oh, honey," in a voice so gentle it almost broke her. "I'm fine," Rose said brightly. "Back to normal." Mrs. Gable patted her hand and didn't say a word, which was worse than anything she could have said. Chad came in and ordered a latte and asked, hesitantly, if Rose could do the abstract art. Like the Futility of Ambition one? Rose poured a heart, a perfect textbook heart. Chad looked at it and looked at her and had the good sense to just say, "Cool, thanks." At night, she cleaned the shop alone, the way she always had before. She wiped down the counter and restocked the napkins. His system. His perfect, beautiful, annoyingly efficient system. And the silence pressed against her like a physical weight. Elowen was quiet too. Her wolf sat in the back of her mind, rigid and proper as always, but turned toward a direction that led nowhere, toward a presence that wasn't there. She didn't whine. She didn't keen. She just sat, very still, very dignified, and waited. On the third night, Rose's phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Callum. Your cold brew ratio was incorrect. It should be 1:8, not 1:7. This has been troubling me. She stared at it. She bit her lip. She typed back. Is this your way of saying you miss me? 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again, disappeared. Then, Callum. The ratio is objectively wrong, Rose. She laughed. It was a wet, hiccuping, undignified laugh that echoed off the walls of the empty shop. She typed, Come fix it yourself, then. He replied in 2 seconds. He had never replied to anything in 2 seconds in his life. Callum. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. She put her phone down. She pressed her hands over her face. She was smiling so hard it hurt. In her mind, Elowen's ears perked forward, just barely, and her tail gave one single, precise, dignified wag. Just one. She had standards, after all. He showed up at 5:47 a.m. because he was constitutionally incapable of being on time when on time meant he could have been early. He was wearing a suit because he'd come from the palace, and he looked absurd and formal and completely out of place standing on her doorstep in the gray pre-dawn light. She opened the door. She was wearing the Depresso t-shirt and had flour on her nose from the morning batch of muffins. They looked at each other. The ratio, he said. The ratio, she agreed. He stepped inside, the door closed. And then he kissed her, or she kissed him, or they met somewhere in the middle, and it didn't matter who started it because it felt like finishing something, like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. His hands cradled her face like she was something precious and impossible. Her fingers curled into the lapels of his ridiculous suit. He tasted like black coffee, bitter and strong, and she tasted like cinnamon and sugar, and together it was the best thing either of them had ever tasted. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers, she whispered, Your ratio critique was noted. I have a proposal, he said, his voice rough. If it involves renaming my shop, the answer is still no. There is an empty lot, he said, 40 meters from your front door. I've had Marcus look into it. It's zoned for commercial use. I can have a structure built in 3 months, a proper office, close enough to walk to the shop for coffee in the morning, close enough to... He stopped, swallowed. The words were easier than they used to be, but they still didn't come naturally. Close enough to you. She pulled back so she could see his face. He looked nervous. The Alpha King of the Northern Bloodstone Pack, the man who negotiated with ancient powers and commanded armies, looked nervous because he was asking a coffee shop owner if he could build an office on her block. You want to move your entire royal operation, she said slowly, to a lot next to a coffee shop called Grounds for Divorce. It is a strategically sound location, he said, with the air of a man who had rehearsed this argument. Central, accessible, good infrastructure. You rehearsed this. I made a spreadsheet. She laughed, the real laugh, the one that made her eyes crinkle, and he felt it in his chest like a match being struck. Show me the spreadsheet, she said. He pulled out his phone and showed her the spreadsheet. It had color-coded columns and a cost-benefit analysis, and a section labeled Proximity Advantages that was written in the driest, most clinical language imaginable, but clearly, unmistakably meant, I want to be near you every day for the rest of my life. And this is the only way I know how to say it. She read every line. Then she looked up at him with bright eyes and said, Your font choice is terrible. Is that a yes? It's a yes. The office was completed in 11 weeks because when the Alpha King wanted something built, it got built fast. It was a handsome stone building with wide windows and clean lines, and it looked exactly like what it was: a seat of power that happened to be 40 meters from a coffee shop with a rude name. On the first morning, Callum walked to Grounds for Divorce at 5:50 a.m. Rose handed him a coffee over the counter. "That'll be $4.75, she said. He looked at her. "What?" she said innocently. "You're not on the payroll anymore. Full price, Your Majesty." He paid. He left a tip that was 3 times the cost of the coffee. She rolled her eyes. He almost smiled. This was their language now, a conversation made of coffee and stubbornness and the quiet, steady knowledge that they would do this again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. Marcus came in every morning and ordered from Rose, and then walked the 40 meters to the office with a grin on his face that suggested he was enjoying this more than any beta in the history of betas had ever enjoyed anything. The council members grumbled, but the grumbling had no real heat in it. Their king was sharper than he'd been in years, more decisive, faster to laugh. Not a lot, not loud, but the fact that he laughed at all was a seismic event. Whatever the Omega with the coffee shop had done to him, it was working. Rose visited the office at lunchtime, always with 2 sandwiches, because Callum still forgot to eat unless someone put food directly into his hands. She'd sit on the edge of his desk while he worked, her legs swinging, reading aloud the most ridiculous customer complaints from the shop's review page. And he would listen with his pen still moving across the page, and the ghost of a smile on his lips. Their wolves settled into it too, slowly, in their own way. Callum's wolf still found Elowyn insufferably rigid. Elowyn still found Callum's wolf overbearing and spatially inconsiderate. But the insults had changed texture, the way they do when 2 creatures have stopped fighting about whether they belong together and started fighting about everything else instead, which is really just another word for intimacy. "You're in my space again," Elowyn would communicate, with a flick of her copper tail. "You have too much space," his wolf would rumble back. "It's inefficient." "I'm optimizing," Elowyn would huff. His wolf would settle closer. She would not move away. The twins arrived on a Tuesday in late autumn, 2 years after a poker game and a pink apron. They came early because they were Callum's children and therefore incapable of being on time when they could be ahead of schedule. Rose labored for 14 hours, during which Callum held her hand and said nothing, and did not let go, and turned a shade of gray that made Marcus genuinely concerned for his king's health. Rose, between contractions, told him he looked worse than she did, and he said, "That is statistically unlikely," and she laughed so hard the nurse told her to stop. A boy and a girl, small and perfect and furious at the world for being so bright and so loud. The boy howled the moment he hit the air, a sound so authoritative that 2 nurses flinched. The girl was silent, her dark eyes wide open, studying the room with an expression of cool, measured assessment. "She's you," Rose whispered, exhausted, radiant, holding the girl against her chest. "He's you," Callum replied, looking at the boy, who was still howling with the passionate indignation of someone who had opinions about the temperature. His voice was rough, with something too large for words. He touched the boy's fist, and the tiny fingers curled around his thumb, and the alpha king of the Northern Bloodstone Pack, who had commanded armies and negotiated with ancient powers, and survived 12 years without smiling, felt a tear slide down his cheek, and did not wipe it away. They named the girl Arabella. Rose chose it. She said it was elegant and timeless and suited a princess. It was. It was also derived from Arabica, the most prized coffee bean in the world, and Rose knew this and Callum did not, and she planned to keep it that way for as long as humanly possible. They named the boy Cassius. Rose chose that one too, because Callum, when presented with the task of naming a human being, had frozen with the paralyzed expression of a man who had been handed a responsibility for which no spreadsheet existed. She told him it was a strong name, a warrior's name, a name that meant hollow in Latin, but sounded like it meant unconquerable. It did. It was also 1 letter away from cassia, the cinnamon plant, the spice that had been Rose's scent from the very first day. the smell that had filled the shop on every morning that mattered. She named her children after the two things that had built her life: coffee and cinnamon, the bean and the warmth. And she hid it in plain sight, in names so regal that the entire pack council nodded their approval without a flicker of suspicion. Marcus figured it out in about 30 seconds. He said nothing. He just looked at Rose across the hospital room, with an expression of pure, delighted conspiracy, and she winked at him, and Callum, holding his son, missed the entire exchange. 6 months later, on a quiet afternoon, Callum walked the 40 meters from his office to the coffee shop, the way he did every day. The bell chimed. Rose looked up from the counter. Arabella was sleeping in a carrier near the pastry display, her small face serene. Cassius was in a bouncer behind the counter, gnawing on a teething ring and growling softly at it, which the regulars found enchanting. "The usual?" Rose asked, already reaching for a cup. "Always," he said, and the word was a vow, the same way it had been the first time he said it to her. She made him a flat white. He took a sip. "The ratio is correct," he said, with the gravity of a man delivering a state address. "High praise from the king," she said. "Don't let it go to your head." He leaned against the counter, watching her work, the same way he'd watched her 1,000 times before. She moved through her shop like music, quick and certain, the curls escaping behind her ears, the flour dust on her apron, the fierce, bright, beautiful chaos of her. "Hey, King Cupcake," she said without looking up. "Less staring, more wiping. That case isn't going to clean itself." He picked up a cloth. He was the Alpha King. He was an off-duty barista with no clearance to operate the panini press. He was a father of 2 children named after a bean and a spice, though he didn't know that yet. He was, for the first time in his life, exactly where he was supposed to be. In his mind, his wolf lay stretched out and warm. In hers, Elowen lay beside him, copper fur just barely touching his dark flank. Not because an instinct demanded it, not because a bond compelled it, because they chose it. Every day. Stubbornly. Imperfectly. On purpose. The kingdom was safe, the coffee was brewing, the queen of his heart still charged him full price. Life was good.